which is in South Korea, and to speak about the kind of implications of what's going on there right now. I want to begin by speaking about the unfinished Korean War, because the militarization of JeJu, both past and present, is impossible to understand. What's that? Oh, closer? Okay, this sounds really loud to my ears. Is this okay? It's not? Okay. All right. So the militarization of JeJu, past and present, is impossible to understand outside the framework of the Korean War, even though the collateralization of JeJu, which I'll speak about, within US military designs for the larger Asia-Pacific region, troubles the received periodization of the Korean War, which most Americans believe was a conflict that began in 1950 and tidily ended in 1953. Nothing could be further from the truth. And I think it's important now, like when we're embroiled in so many conflicts around the world, to understand how unending wars that the US got involved in and never formally resolved with a peace treaty, what the impact of that is in the long term. And Korea provides, unfortunately, a perfect case study of that. So it's important to recall that this year marks the 70th anniversary of the US-authored division of the Korean Peninsula. And this was a US-authored partition. It's worth reflecting on this history, which few people in the United States know or typically care much about. And I would just say here, I would just quote from Chalmers Johnson. Chalmers Johnson has pointed out that it's typical of an imperial people to have a short memory for its less pleasant imperial acts. But for those on the receiving end, memory can be long indeed. It's especially important to reflect upon this history because of the imperial amnesia that dogs US state-level accounts of the Korean War, which was directly consequent to the US division of the Korean Peninsula. So in other words, the Korean War was consequent to the US-authored division. It's a very different narrative from the kind of received narrative that we hear, which is that the North Koreans started it, right? Indeed, each subsequent decade has seen the US ROK, or South Korean, proclamations of its vaunted bonds forged in blood, renewed between respective heads of state, between these two Cold War allies. And so whenever there is joint commemoration, South Korean and US heads of state always refer to this term, bonds forged in blood. In this way, the official time frame of the Korean War, defined by its supposed start date of June 25th, 1950, has obscured the fact that the Korean War is in point of fact not only not over, but also serves as the volatile substratum for US military designs throughout the general Asia-Pacific region. So this kind of volatility, this kind of flashpoint, serves as a very sort of flexible, strategic staging ground for the United States. In the 1960s, for example, Lyndon Johnson referred to US, quote-unquote, sacrifice in the Korean War as South Korea's debt of honor, a debit on a geopolitical balance sheet that would justify the coalitional deployment, as many of you know, of over 300,000 South Korean troops to Vietnam. That this debt of honor, is apparently undischargeable is evident in South Korea's support of every major armed US intervention since Vietnam. A year and a half ago, on the 60th anniversary, Mike, would you mind going to the next slide? Okay. On the 60th anniversary of the signing of the July 27th, 1953 Korean War Armistice Agreement, here, there we go, okay. So on the 60th anniversary, on July 27th, 1953, on the 60th anniversary of the July 27th, 1953 Korean War Armistice Agreement that halted hot fighting but did not bring about permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, Barack Obama, in a joint US ROK commemorative ceremony dubbed heroes remembered. This is part of the sort of government's whitewashing of US wars. And we see that in, for example, the DoD's initiative to whitewash the Vietnam War as well. And this was held on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Barack Obama stated that the enduring lesson of the Korean War, again, the Korean War framed as a purely defensive, sacrificial action undertaken by the United States on behalf of its under-equipped, potentially outmatched, but assuredly democratic South Korean ally, is that the United States will maintain the strongest military the world has ever known, bar none, always. This is the lesson of the Korean War, right? Its durable relevance to today. In a plug for his militarized pivot policy, which I'll speak a little bit more about later, to Asia and the Pacific, and this policy goes totally under-considered because all eyes of the world are on the Middle East, where the United States has been embroiled in a series of wars, and we've seen Barack Obama as interventionist, if not more in some ways than his predecessor, George W. Bush. But this has obscured his intensely militarized Asia-Pacific policy. And this is not unimportant because the United States views the Asia-Pacific region as its economic future, right? So this is what he, in a plug for his militarized pivot policy, Obama continued. What our allies across the Asia-Pacific know, and as we have proven in Korea for 60 straight years, is that the United States will remain a force for peace and security and prosperity. That's a victory. That's your legacy. And he's speaking to South Korean dignitaries and US-Korean War veterans. So he's basically declaring that the Korean War, I mean, who knew? It was a victory. The United States apparently won, after all, right? I mean, this is gross revisionism at its worst. So the Korean War, framed in this way triumphantly as an American story, as Obama revealingly referred to it, is that the war was no tie. Korea was a victory when 50 million South Koreans live in freedom, a vibrant democracy, one of the world's most dynamic economies, in stark contrast to the repression, poverty of the North. That's a victory, that's your legacy. Yet if the Korean War is, as Obama argued, profoundly an American story, it demands backdating at least to the US decision immediately following its atomic bombings of civilian populations at Hiroshima and Nagasaki to draw a line, the 38th parallel, through the Korean Peninsula, cleaving it in half. Then this line, far from being a neutral or a bloodless affair, tragically sealed Korea's fate from then to now. So let's recall how and when the division of Korea was accomplished. In August 1945, two junior US Army officers, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel, armed only with a National Geographic map of Korea, zero knowledge of the country, its history, its language, its people, making no attempt at consultation with any Korean, divided a long colonized country in two, taking pains to ensure that Seoul would be in the US occupation zone. Would you mind going to the next slide? Dustin, can you do that? Would you mind? Mike, how about Dustin does it? Dustin can do it. Would you mind? And I'm gonna get my water, sorry. So this is a quotation from Bruce Cummings. He's the eminent Korean War historian at the University of Chicago. He has stated that there is no historical justification for Korea's division. If any East Asian country should have been divided, it was Japan, like Germany, an aggressor. Instead, Korea, China, Vietnam were all divided in the aftermath of World War II. There was no internal pretext for dividing Korea either. The 38th parallel was never a line. I mean, it had no organic meaning in Korea, noticed by the people of Kaesong, the Koryo capital, which cut the parallel in half. But then it became the only line that mattered to Koreans, a boundary to be removed by any means necessary. So basically, the division of the Korean peninsula ensured that a war of national reunification would ensue. Let's think about this as a trigger for the Korean War. And the US military occupation of Korea, which had been a colony of Japan, not the enemy. And indeed, an American socialist observer, Anna Louise Strong, she was in North Korea before the start of the Korean War. She stated, Korea was a victim of Japanese aggression, not an enemy. I mean, she had to state it that point blank. Yet according to a report dated September 4th, 1945, General John Hodge, R. Hodge, instructed his own officers that Korea, quote, was an enemy of the United States, and therefore subject to the provisions and terms of the surrender. As General Hodge landed and the first contingent of US military forces began arriving in Korea, he was directed by General Douglas MacArthur to treat the civilian population they encountered as quote unquote liberated people. So in other words, they're not the enemy, they're liberated people. We liberated them, right? With Japan's defeat, Korea's liberation, that sort of thing, right? The decisions Hodge made, however, bespoke a different attitude. Southern Korea, Cummings writes, was subjected to a hostile occupation, possessing the full panoply of powers of a victory in enemy territory. Since they treated their administration of the Koreans under their trusteeship as an occupation, a military occupation, the US forces simply retooled a bureaucratic apparatus that had been created by the Japanese, essentially replacing Japanese colonial managers with Koreans who had been loyal to the Japanese, right? And I should also add that this division of the Korean peninsula effectively divided 1 in 3 Korean families. When you see those heart-wrenching images of family reunions that are staged between North and South Korea from time to time, that is an effect and consequence of the ongoing Korean War. So, as Cummings writes, many Americans expressed surprise to learn of the US occupation in which Americans operated a full military government from 1945 to 1948. A.M. Rosenthal, a former editor and columnist of the New York Times, wrote in 1986 that the government of Korea functioned throughout the peninsula in 1945. So, like, this New York Times columnist is stating that there was a government of Korea operating in Korea. This is factually totally incorrect. This is what Bruce Cummings writes. This is exactly backwards. An ostensible Korean government did exist, and this is very important, within a few weeks of Japan's demise. So as soon as Japan was defeated, a full-blown grassroots self-governing apparatus emerged. Its headquarters was in Seoul. It began in mid-August with a committee for the preparation of Korean independence, and by September, it was becoming anchored in widespread people's committees in the countryside. So the people's committees were in the north, they were in the south, they were a complete hail sign of the self-governing capacity of Koreans. And even the CIA, in a 1948 document, conceded that the people's committees were, quote, a grassroots independence movement which found expression throughout Korea in August 1945. Even the CIA conceded this. Okay, but the division of the Korean peninsula set the stage for a regime of white terror and right-wing authoritarianism deferring the project of decolonization in South Korea to this day. So against what Barack Obama said, democracy, if we can even call what exists in South Korea under the right-wing Park Geun-hye and with the draconian reanimation of the national security law, the red baiting that we see there, the attempt by the government to eviscerate any kind of left progressive movement. But if we can talk about democracy emerging after a succession of US-sponsored and supported military dictatorships in South Korea, it emerged not because of US intervention, but precisely despite it, right? So would you mind going to the next slide? And so Nam Hee Lee, I know this is very small, she's a wonderful historian at UCLA, and she wrote this book called The Making of Minjung. And she states that a Chicago Sun-Times reporter visiting South Korea during the US military government period noted in 1946 that the victim was already, in advance, deemed as a communist and enemy of the state. Okay. To prove their case, the police set about wringing a confession from them. So, the Cold War may have been cold in many parts of the West, but it was hot in the former colonized world. It was bloody, it was brutal. Mass murder and rape of those considered leftists and dissenters were not isolated events in the immediate post-1945 period. And then here, I want to underscore this. The massacre of the Jeju people occurred 2 years before the Korean War. In 1948, and is known as the Jeju Uprising, the combined forces of police and paramilitary groups with the guidance of US military officers killed more than 10% of the island's population. Recent statistics and research reveal that it's actually closer to 30%. When the 6th and 14th regiments stationed in Yosu and Suncheon refused to participate in the suppression of the Jeju people and rebelled, citizens of these cities were subjected to summary executions and indiscriminate detention in concentration camps. Thousands were executed, imprisoned. Those who were left in prison were executed during the Korean War. So many people were killed during this period. So many of their family members were subsequently barred from employment and other social activities that one observer was led to comment about the southern region of South Korea that was nominated by the US occupation authorities a red region. It's no wonder that Jeolla province is void of the talented. People have been wiped out, right? It was so extreme. This is a campaign of systematic white terror of a very extraordinarily right-wing reactionary nature in the South. And many people will say that, the Jeju Uprising is understood to have occurred before the Korean War started, but I just pose a question. Why? Why should it be that only when North Korea crossed over the 38th parallel, that's when the Korean War started? Why can't it start with this kind of massive atrocity? And many people see what happened in Jeju as a training exercise for the way that the United States approached North Korea. North Korea also the United States construed North Korea as a giant free fire zone. It was known as a red region, and the US was absolutely unrestrained in its use of air power, which it maintained a monopoly over. And the total death toll on the Korean Peninsula during this period of hot fighting, when all the dust cleared, there was an estimated 4 million dead, 70% of whom were civilian. There are some estimates that 3.5 million people died in North Korea alone. The United States was absolutely unrestrained in its use of firepower, making no distinction between civilian and military infrastructures. I say this because this is the historical memory of ruin that is absolutely foundational to the consolidation of the North Korean state. Yet, even though that's our story, it's an American story, few Americans know it. So I want to talk about Jeju and the periodization. Oh, would you mind going to the next? So this is a picture of Pyongyang in 1953, and the United States dropped on this city that had 400,000 people over 420,000 bombs. It's kind of nice to know that there's more than one bomb allocated per person. Okay, so I would just say, so for more plausible ways to understand the triggers for the Korean War, of the United States authorship of Korea's division into Soviet and US occupation zones at the Pacific War's end, Bruce Cummings states, from partition forward, war was predictable, if not inevitable. Okay, US authorship, it prompted a war of national reunification. This was most powerfully manifested in Jeju. Given that what started out as a temporary line hardened, so this 38th parallel hardened as the Cold War intensified into an impermeable wall that blocked the free movement of people and ideology, it just ensured that a civil war aimed at reunifying the peninsula would follow. Not, to be clear, an international border, but an imposed division that has lethally polarized the peninsula to this day. The line bisecting the Koreas, neither of which constitutionally recognizes the other, has engendered an antagonistic topography, political economy, and cultural imaginary of war. And so I want to talk about Jeju's durable significance relative to the Korean War and US designs relative to the larger Asia-Pacific region. It's really important to understand that the primary way, which Mike, would you mind going to the next slide? The primary way that Jeju is understood in South Korea is as a kind of island paradise. Okay, I mean, it's really described in these kinds of like lush terms. It's shrouded in a kind of mystique. It's a land of diving women. It has world-famous honey-sweet tangerines. It has a very colorful local dialect, clear ocean waters, unparalleled natural beauty. It's been a honeymoon destination for decades, right? And so this is actually from John Merrill. John Merrill's a very interesting guy because he actually did some very important inaugural research on the Jeju uprising. He now works as, he's a researcher in the State Department for the Korea desk. That's what happens to some academics, I guess. But, yeah. Okay, but even he gives a sort of lowdown on the kind of image of Jeju, and then at the end says, for beneath the island's natural beauty and newfound prosperity lies a tragic and bloody past. So even in 1980, he's pointing it out. Can you go to the next slide? I mean, you can tell it's gorgeous. I mean, it is undoubtedly, without question, gorgeous. Would you mind going to the next? And so I want to talk a little bit about militarism in Jeju. On the right, you have the way that Jeju is pitched in terms of the tourist industry. And on the left, it's really hard to recognize, but this is the excavation of bodies. This is decades after. It's in like the 1990s that you have this excavation of bodies of people who are mass slaughtered under US occupation authority. Okay, and so the definition of militarism actually comes from an American Indian writer named Lewis Owens, as many of you might know, but I think it's most profoundly theorized by Teresia Teiwa. And she talks about like the term bikini, because bikini both signifies a sort of, a swimsuit, something that you wear when you go on vacation, go to the beach, but it also signifies bikini atoll, right? And so she states that militarism points to the nexus of militarism and tourism, operating in the Pacific and the Caribbean. Militarism and tourism are often twinned processes in neocolonialism. Both are highly gendered and racialized. Island economies are dependent on both military spending and tourist dollars, and little other economic development is encouraged. the mutual constitution of the tourist and military industries, particularly in the island tropics, and how the tourist industry masks the military force behind it. The stereotype of the peaceful and exotic Pacific Islands has been created through centuries of colonialism and a tourist industry that has mystified the region's militarization and nuclearization. And I would just add that so Jeju becomes a very interesting site because it challenges the triumphalist narrative of the Korean War along the lines that Obama gave in 2013 on the National Mall, as a sort of conflict that's brought about peace and democracy to South Korea. It was actually officially designated in 2005 as an island of world peace. He announced it as the island of world peace not because it's so gorgeous, but because of the image on the left. The South Korean then president acknowledged that the South Korean government was responsible under US occupation authority for the slaughter, wholesale slaughter, indiscriminate women, children, grandparents, the whole shebang. And for that reason, it's on the basis of indiscriminate war that was deployed against Jeju that the designation Island of World Peace came about at all. So Jeju reveals that South Korea's roots, its roots, are located in US-backed counterinsurgencies against common people. And this is the dark, ugly, and blood-soaked history in which the United States bears ultimate responsibility for the deaths of almost 1/3 of the Jeju Islanders in the middle of the 20th century. And I really do encourage us to think about the Jeju Islanders' struggle with both mainland Korean as well as international allies as central to what Filipino scholar and activist Walden Bello has called the People's Pacific. So would you mind going to the next slide? As implausible as this may sound, Jeju, which is, you can see there, it's the southernmost region of the Korean Peninsula, is intimately intertwined in South Korean national security discourse with the so-called North Korean threat. And indeed, whenever the United States offloads and sells weapons systems to South Korea, it's to curb the North Korean threat, right? So there's always this kind of very strategic language that is used. And so basically, with regard to both the genocidal scorched earth policy that was carried out under US occupation authority in 1948, this was actually, it's important to realize that this was justified against fears that North Korea was setting the agenda for the uprising of the Jeju Islanders against US intervention in Korea. And then that's 48. Let's flash forward to the present. The North Korean threat is also central to the naval base construction in the past several years in Jeju Island. And South Korean authorities have claimed that anti-base islanders have been influenced by the Jongbuk, or the pro-North, politics of mainlanders who've imposed their sort of socialist, communist views on the islanders. So it's viewed as not indigenous, it's always foreign, it has to do with North Korea somehow infiltrating its way to Jeju Island, right? Would you mind going to the next slide? So you could, let me say, okay, so basically, even during the Japanese colonial occupation of Korea, Jeju was heavily militarized by Japan, right? It was heavily militarized. But then, in 1946, with the changing of the Imperial Guard and the United States coming in, the Associated Press, in an article from New York, reported that Jeju Island had the possibility of turning into a Gibraltar of the West Pacific, causing a great sensation in the Korean media. On March 28, 1947, at a conference between Seung-min Rhee, the South Korean president, and Mr. Draper, the US undersecretary, the South Korean president said, "I've heard that the USA might have an intention to build a naval base on Jeju Island," and added, "If the Korean government is established, i.e. if you, the US, help us establish this reactionary government in the South, I'm sure the Korean people will willingly let the USA construct a permanent base on JeJu Island. I mean, it didn't happen then, but it's happening now, right? Would you mind going to? So I just wanted to show you this slide. It's basically in JeJu Village in JeJu Island. You can see that the South Korean Navy is hanging a banner, which basically translates into "Go away, leftist pro-North Koreans. We strongly support the Jeju Naval Base project." I mean, it's really quite outlandish. Okay, so let me just, would you mind going to the next slide? And in fact, so you can see here that there's a kind of curse of geography. Jeju is a sort of hub with almost equidistant spokes going to Beijing, Vladivostok, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Taipei, right? And at the very bottom, here you see on the right US Navy Aegis destroyers, but at the bottom, a JeJu villager, she's this tiny, like 4 foot, I don't even know, like 4'8" tangerine farmer. And she comes from the village, and she said, she responded to the question as to why she got involved in the anti-base struggle. And she said, "At first I fought only with a single heart to save my farmland and village, but I realized that this struggle is not only for our Kangjong," right? And she even describes Kangjong as a village that would ordinarily seem as insignificant as a speck of dust to the world, had it not been for its geostrategic significance. And then she states, "I came to realize that the naval base is encouraging the threat of war in Northeast Asia and around the world. And as any people know who host a US base, that makes you a target. That makes you a target." Okay, would you mind going to next? So just to say, from August 14th, 1945 to August 15th, 1948, the United States American military government was the sole legal authority in South Korea, south of 38th parallel. Under secret protocols, the United States had operational control of the South Korean armed forces and national policy from 1948 to 1949. This is when the uprising and massacre occurs in Jeju. And I would just also add that to this day, the United States maintains operational control over the South Korean military in times of war, but we've never not been in time of war when it comes to Korea, right? So, okay. And I just want to point out that what's going on in Jeju today with the undemocratic construction of the military base and what happened, this massacre in 1948, there's a kind of uncanny resonance between the two. In fact, Bruce Cummings describes the peace that followed in the aftermath of this slaughter as the peace of a political graveyard. So this basically fostered a persistent structure of fear, born of intimate knowledge of state-sponsored violence. And so basically, just to speak a little bit more of this, this is totally tied to the division of the Korean Peninsula. In 1948, in April, the United States prompted separate elections in the South under the UN mantle, ensuring that the August 1945 US-authored division of the country would be permanent. Long story short, the people of Jeju rose up in opposition, and what would ensue, a long bloodbath, would stand as an object lesson to Koreans in the South for many decades to come. And so this is an image of the people who are about to be executed. Bruce Cummings states, "If it should come to pass that any Koreans succeed in gaining compensation, i.e. reparations, from the American government for the events of 1945 to 1953, certainly the people of Jeju should come first. For it was on that hauntingly beautiful island that the post-war world first witnessed the American capacity for unrestrained violence against indigenous peoples fighting for self-determination and social justice." And historians of this massacre from Jeju themselves Liken this to the scorched earth policies that were carried out in US campaigns of extermination against indigenous people on this land, right? And so basically what happened under US occupation authority was intense red baiting, and it's also happening now. The United States Counterintelligence Corps and its goons, including a fascist youth group called the Northwest Youth League, which was primarily made up of North Koreans. So this fascist youth group of North Korean elites, people who owned property, they were landowners, people who were elite Christians, people who had collaborated with Japanese colonial authority, those people fled, and they primarily made up this fascist youth group. And they perpetuated a wholesale massacre of the island's residents, accompanied by a scorched earth policy. The irony about this supposed North Korean threat/infiltration pretext is that the bloodbath turned on the idea that the islanders who were resisting US-UN intervention in the form of externally imposed elections, southern elections, that the pretext that they maintained ties with North Korea and were communist aligned, basically misread who the North Korean threat actually was. The North Korean threat was actually this fascist group of thugs who were operating under US military authority. And so the thing to remember too is that Jeju had actually no significant ties to the North. They didn't even have particularly strong ties to South Korea's Workers' Party. And even, so prior to this 1948 massacre, US occupation commander John Hodge told a group of visiting US legislators in 1947 that Jeju was, quote, a truly communal area that is peacefully controlled by the People's Committee without much Comintern influence, end quote. They were moderate leftists. They were not avowed communists. In some cases, they were even, bizarrely enough, pro-American. And so basically, as I stated, approximately 80,000 people were killed out of a total island population of 300,000 people. Nearly all the houses in the center of the island near the volcano were demolished. Tens of thousands of people ironically fled to Japan, where many had been slave laborers during the Japanese occupation of Korea. Not a family on the island remained untouched. And yet the United States has never recognized this, and a historian of this atrocity, Kim Jong-min, states, he stated last year when he visited the United States, that the United States is culpable for genocide. And when I went to Jeju for the first time in the 1990s, my Korean wasn't very good, and I was speaking with a grandmother at a sort of motel. And she asked me a question. I thought, oh God, I'm not understanding her because I had no idea what had happened. She asked me, she said, do you see any grandfathers around? And I said, no. I mean, I didn't even think about it, you know? And she said, they killed them all. I said, they killed them all? Who killed? I mean, I couldn't understand what she meant. Now I know, right? And so, would you mind going to the next slide? So basically, in January of 2005, in contrite acknowledgement of the indiscriminate bloodbath perpetrated in 1948 by South Korean forces under the authority of the US military government, the Nonghyun administration designated the island an island of world peace. It also established a museum to commemorate the massacre. So, I mean, you see that basically the Nonghyun administration declared Jeju an island of world peace at the same time that the Nonghyun, a liberal president, declared the construction of a naval base at Gangjeong, stating that peace without armament cannot exist. This is a really devastating pronouncement for an island like Jeju. So it's a neoliberal president who actually brings the idea to surface. He's not the one who realizes this. And you should also realize that one of the reasons he wants this, and he wants the militarization of South Korea, is because he wants the US to leave. And this becomes one of the ways that the United States might be compelled to extricate itself from Korea. So let me say, and actually let me just say this too, he and his Kim Dae-jung, who won a Nobel Prize for Peace and also liberal president of South Korea, both of these guys are human rights figures. They envisioned a forward deployed South Korean Navy that was capable of power projection across the waters, but free from a US military yoke. The basic message was, we can defend ourselves, we don't need you. You know, get out, right? And so this liberal blueprint for military self-defense was transformed under the conservative presidency of Lee Myung-bak into a tightening of relations with the United States in a moment, and this is the catch, of vying supremacy with China for access to global markets and resources. Would you mind going to the next slide? So here you have an image of Roh Moo-hyun actually formally acknowledging official responsibility for the massacre. So I mention all of this stuff because the uprisings of the past haunt contemporary anti-war, anti-base, anti-militarism struggles in Korea, and Jeju continues to be a flashpoint in the Korean people's long struggle for peace. Basically, under the Lee Myung-bak and now Park Geun-hye governments, South Korea has beaten, and I mean beaten, and imprisoned anti-base activists, levied massive fines against them, raided peace organization headquarters and offices under the cover of the national security law. So, in other words, if the 1948 uprising and massacre on Jeju calls into question the 1950 inauguration of the Korean War, calling into question that start date, the government's current construction of a naval base and ruthless suppression of the anti-base movement over the opposition of most of the residents of Gangjong, which is the village where this is getting constructed, points to enduring a resolution of the Korean War. Would you mind going to the next slide? So you can see, like, this is a kind of blueprint for the base. It's projected to be able to accommodate 20 big warships and 150,000 ton size supposed cruise ships at the same time. So war and tourism all in one, right? And if you actually, when they were initially building this, there were posters around the village that showed like the base, and then it showed like tourists going through. It even showed a blonde girl skating, roller skating, and eating an ice cream cone. So, I mean, it's just so bizarre. And so the question that a lot of people have asked is this a US base, or is this a South Korean base? And we should realize that under Obama, and lots of Asia-Pacific activists nominate this Obama's doctrine, the Obama doctrine, Obama has sought to offload the military burden of the United States onto its allies while it is militarizing, right? This is not a decrease in militarization, it's an offloading of the burden sharing logic. The United States is striving for a faster, lighter military, a lighter blueprint due to advanced technology. It wants floating missile defense systems in massive naval carriers. All of this enables the US to argue that it's demilitarizing when it's not. Would you mind going to the next slide? So, I mean, here you have Hillary Clinton basically speaking about how important the Asia-Pacific region is to the United States. The United States is a Pacific power, and you can read this in a foreign policy article from, I think it's 2011, called America's Pacific Century. Could you go to the next slide? So here's the question about, is this a US base or not? Well, it doesn't even matter if it's a US base or not, and it doesn't matter for the United States vis-a-vis its client states and its allies within the region, because under these very unequal treaties, like the SOFA, the Status of Forces Agreement, mutual defense treaties, visiting forces agreements. The United States can use any base, any port, any airfield at whim and at will. So, I mean, it doesn't even matter. I mean, this is an incredible ability to militarize without nominating it US militarism, right? Would you mind going to the next? And so, like, why is this? Well, this goes to the pivot policy. The United States is shifting its strategic center from the Atlantic to Asia and the Pacific. It actually wants to shift 60% of its naval power to Asia and the Pacific. It's right now and has been securing more naval bases and port calls in the region, including in places like Cam Bay. I mean, it's so bizarre to see what's going on right now. And it's doing so because it wants to contain and outcompete China. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to understand what's going on. Oh, and also I want to mention that there's also, yeah, here we go. So why is it likely to use this? Well, because you can see here, the United States wants to increase the Aegis ballistic missile defense program from 23 in 2011 to 41 in 2016. According to bilateral secret negotiations, South Korea should contribute to missile defense for Okinawa and Guam. I mean, think about this kind of chain of complicity that exists, in US militarism. And also these joint military drills and operations, AKA war games, which are conducted to demonstrate the interoperability of the US military and that of its allies. Basically, it's just a seamless operation. And so basically we can conclude that the Jeju Naval Base will be a crucial outpost for the US-led Aegis ballistic missile defense program in East Asia. Would you mind going to? And so, I mean, let's go to the next one. We've sort of talked about some of this. With regard to JeJu Village, I want to highlight how undemocratic it is, and then I'm almost done. This is a major people's struggle. In April 26, 2007, the South Korean government declared that it was going to construct a naval base. And I know I shouldn't mention this because this is something that activists state within Jeju, but basically the government went to Hwasun first. Hwasun is a port that actually kind of made sense. Why? Because the Japanese had constructed a major naval port there. It already had some of the infrastructure. It could have been built there. But who came out in opposition? It was the sea diving woman. The sea diving woman said, not in our backyard. We farm from this ocean. We fish from this ocean. This ocean is our livelihood. We are the guardians of the sea. Get out. So then they went to another port called Wimi. Same thing. The Henyo, the diving woman, came out. They said, not in my backyard. Finally, they went to Gangjeong. And they went to the women sea divers first, and they bribed them. These women are not sufficient to make up a plurality in terms of their votes, but they bribe them. And how do they bribe them? Well, because in South Korea, the central government is based in Seoul, and resources and goods go to Seoul. Jeju is its own province. It's not just an island, it's its own province, and it's so under-resourced. And I talked to some of the diving women who actually voted for the base, and it was a really irregular, undemocratic proceeding. And what they said was, we were promised an old folks' home. There wasn't one. We were promised health care. We were promised education. That way our children and grandchildren won't leave. They were promised the basics. So basically there's a hijacking of elections. Only 87 of almost 2,000 villagers participated in the vote. There was no debate allowed. And the most unorthodox method, if you vote for this, clap your hands. Okay. In 2007, horrified, August 20th, 2007, a few months later, horrified by what happened, the villagers organized their own formal vote. Out of almost 2,000 villagers, 725 participated, 680 were firmly opposed. That's a 94% rate, right? But the government did not acknowledge the official vote. And they refused to acknowledge this at all. And so, would you mind going to the next? I mean, and you can see, here's the formal vote, and then the next. I mean, there's just a ton of pictures. Here's a sea diving woman. They're amazing. They're so interesting. Would you go to the next? And then here you see how contaminated their waters are by this base, how destructive it is. Mike, could you go to the next? Thanks. You know that beautiful rock at the very beginning, that beautiful pool of water that you saw? That's called Kurumi Rock. It's considered a sacred spot. Look at what it looks like. People put their bodies on the line, and this is what the government has done in this moment of a US military pivot to the region. Would you go to the next image? More images of absolute destruction. And the other thing about Kurumi, this rock formation, is a volcanic rock formation, but it had both salt water and fresh water flowing. I mean, it's such an unusual spot. And it was considered to be an environmentally protected zone. And yet this is happening. Thanks, Mike. Yeah. And so here you see people in the peace movement. These are people who get red baited for being pro-North, and you can possibly be arguing for this if you weren't pro-North, Mike, could you go? And you can see peaceful resistance and then violent response, reaction. Okay. Yeah. This is the chairwoman of the Women's Anti-Base Organization, and in protest, she has shaved her head 3 times. This is Jung Young-hee. Here you see like elderly women villagers, and actually the one on the left is a man. He does a lot of the cooking for the activists, and they are sitting in front of the police, right? Here you see more sort of forms of protest. Again, all throughout the Korean Peninsula, as you can see. Yeah. And then more protest. Again, Samsung, which is one of the major companies. Lockheed Martin as well. And then Jung Young-hee says, when there was she talks about the devastating effect this has had on Kangjong Village. When there was no issue of a naval base, our village had been alive with a Jeju tradition of community spirit. We had performed religious services together, celebrated happy events, commemorated sad ones, farmed collectively with our neighbors. However, the South Korean government and Navy incited a handful of villagers, making them pro-base in order to install the naval base. And they have intentionally conspired to divide the village. With the breaking of this community spirit, we've had difficulty performing our occupations. Respect for elders has disappeared. The pain coming from things like the collapse of communal ethics is heartbreaking. But you still see these kinds of, this is actually every year the villagers and supporters walk the perimeter of the entire island. And then also, again, this is a people struggle, and you see the Kangjong villagers in solidarity with Okinawans. And there's people from Guam have come to Jeju. There's lots here that suggest the people specific. But I have to just say that with regard to Obama's policies in the Asia-Pacific region, he has been hand in glove with right-wing reactionaries. Shinzo Abe, Park Geun-hye, all these kinds of figures. And he's basically been offloading the cost of US militarism to local people who suffer the impact of this. It's profoundly undemocratic. And so we here in the United States, I really do think that the Taiwanese scholar Quan Ching Chen, he states that our task in sites like this is not so much decolonization. It's actually de-imperialization, and it starts with knowing things like this. And I presented this to you. It may seem like it's Korean history. I want us to own this as American history. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. You want to take some questions? Yes?
Is that the ways that we primarily know North Korea and the United States is through lenses of intelligence. And we know, even in terms of both a national security perspective on North Korea as well as a human rights perspective on North Korea, our primary ways of knowing North Korea are through defector intelligence and satellite imagery. That is the way that we know North Korea, and that's also the way that Colin Powell presented his supposedly airtight case to the United Nations in 2003, arguing that we should go to war in Iraq. And so with regard to North Korea, we look at North Korea not through the lens of information, but actually disinformation, because information is a terrain of war, and the United States has never not been at war with North Korea. So one of the truths about North Korea is North Korea has been under a policy of regime change from the US end since its inception, and yet it has continued to survive. I'm not stating that it's not repressive, but I'm also stating that there's an unbelievable existential threat against North Korea. People will say, if you go to North Korea, and I've been there, that people are ordinary. And people are ordinary. And I don't know why that should surprise people, except for the fact that I think that they anticipate that North Koreans are automatons that have green blood or something like that. But, like with regard to North Koreans, they're people with aspirations, they have families, and even the CIA in its report concedes that North Koreans love their families, which I just think is so perverse to even have that kind of a statement. But it's also the case that North Koreans are profoundly touched by the fact that the Korean War is not over. We may not think about it here, it's a forgotten war in the United States, but on the North Korean end, it means extraordinary sanctions. It means US war games that simulate the invasion and occupation of North Korea. It means the United States has threatened North Korea with a nuclear first strike on multiple occasions. These are all the things that means, and it's radical. It was an asymmetrical war in the 1950s. It's asymmetrical to this day.